Download our complimentary guidebooks, checklists, and other useful financial resources at savantwealth.com/guides.
Welcome to today's Savant Live webinar. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dom Parillo from Savant, and I work with our wealth transfer team. And today we're going to discuss optimizing your inheritance. I'm also joined today by Mike Cyrs, one of my colleagues. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Great to be here, Dom. Thanks to everyone for joining us as well. Welcome.
Absolutely. We love doing these things. I think this is going to be a great program. And it dawned on Mike and I that when we're designing these programs for everyone, there's a lot of interest in estate administration in general. So today's presentation is going to be a little bit more narrow in focus with specific regards to someone who just received an inheritance or is maybe anticipating receiving an inheritance in the near future. Let's get started, Mike, and talk about what we're going to present on today. We have a nice roadmap, and we ordered things deliberately here because these are the questions that come to our minds when we evaluate situations. But I think really important when you inherit wealth to understand what the income tax, estate tax, and gift tax implications are for the recipient of the wealth. So we'll cover that. When you inherit wealth, it's often good to review your own estate planning documents and maybe make some changes, right? Because a large inheritance will affect how you might approach things, right? Because it is a significant life event. So we'll talk about proper trust establishment, asset protection concepts. We'll touch a little bit on investment topics. This isn't necessarily meant to be an investment focused conversation, but we want to leave you with some follow-up ideas on what questions to ask your financial advisor, how that inheritance might affect your investment strategy. We'll talk about multi-generational planning, right, as a stage 2 after you receive the wealth. And then we'll talk about some common pitfalls that we often encounter, where things might get overlooked right in those initial stages after the wealth is received and transferred. And then we should have some time for questions as well. We always like to take those too. So Mike, let's get started. Can we get us started on some income tax concepts so our listeners can have a better understanding of what they should be thinking about with regard to different asset types?
Sure, Dom. It's great to have again you all as an audience today and talk about this topic. And again, we're going to try to focus just on the inheritance. I just received an inheritance, or there might be an inheritance coming in the future. What are the things I should be aware of, and what are the strategies? So it's pretty focused today. And we're going to begin, it seems where we always begin and end in these matters, and that's on the tax side of things. And we're going to focus on the income tax side first, because that's where the meat of the strategy is. Good news from an income tax perspective that an inheritance that you receive, generally speaking, is going to be exempt from both federal and state income tax. So if you receive a $100,000 piece of real estate, or some type of bequest of a taxable account, you're not going to have to pick that up on your 1040. So that's great news that you're going to take that income tax free. However, there are exceptions, as they always are, and that is with respect to assets that have grown on a tax advantaged basis during the decedent's lifetime. So of course, these would be ERISA governed accounts. This would be the IRAs, et cetera. The embedded income tax that's inside those assets, that is going to come out, and there's a lot of strategy around not only taking that out, but how that fits into your overall estate plan. So we're gonna have to really go into a deep session there. But generally speaking, you're going to take that inheritance, and it's going to be exempt from income tax. Now, there are a couple of things that are really important to point out here. First and foremost is that you think about the continuum of dividends and interest and earnings and income tax, how it's picked up. For a decedent, up until the time of the date of death, the income tax attributes are going to be picked up on the decedent's 1040. They're under their Social Security number. So all the way up through the point of death, date of death, on that Social Security number. But when you pass away, your Social Security number passes away with you. And at that point in time, the fiduciary, the trust or the estate, is going to need to get a tax ID number, an EIN, and you can do that online or through a process, through an SS4 form through the mail. And then you're going to re-register the accounts under that EIN. Okay. And all of the tax attributes then from that point until the point of distribution are going to get picked up on a tax return called a 1041. So we go from a 1040 of the decedent to an administrative period of a 1041. And ultimately, the income tax that's earned, interest, dividends, et cetera, are going to then end up on the beneficiary's 1040 under their Social Security number. But it's important to point out you might get a small amount of income that's attributable to that point in time between date of death and the point of distribution that's paid through to you on a K1. So we're going to be more forward looking in our strategy, but it's important to remember that backward looking, you might want to say, boy, to the fiduciary, the executor, I received this asset. Am I going to be getting a K1? Now, there may be enough deductions that there's not taxable income, going back, attorney's fees, et cetera, are going to wipe that out. But it's good to know if that K1 is coming. Again, it should be small. If you had a $100,000 inheritance in a taxable account, you might have maybe $1,000 worth of taxable income from that stub time period in there. Life insurance is also income tax free. There is an interrelation between the estate side and the income tax side that could make an insurance trust actually carry with it some taxation from an estate tax side. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, but there can be a mix there. But otherwise, life insurance should be income tax free. Big second point to point out is assets and a basis issue. And that is assets that you receive are going to get a step up in basis at the time of death. So you're receiving an asset, let's say it's a piece of real estate, and a family member acquired that for $100,000. Maybe it's a lake home or something like that. At the point of death, it's worth $400,000 in value. So at that point in time, the basis is going to adjust. The basis is the tax basis that measures capital gains. It's going to adjust from $100,000 to the $400,000 fair market value number, so that ultimately when you sell it, you'll only have the gain from the date of death to the point of your disposition or your sale. So that's important to remember, because if you're inheriting an asset, you want to set that basis and establish it. You want to make sure there's an appraisal or something that establishes that value in place. Make sure you get a copy of that, retain it for your records. But also you want to make sure if you're receiving assets, maybe it's a taxable account, that there has been that adjustment and fair market value to the current basis level. So make sure those assets are stepped up and they don't get reported to the IRS such that they're going to think that you're going to have this capital gain. They're wondering why you haven't paid it. And it's just simply because the assets haven't stepped up in basis. Assets that you receive during lifetime, I just want to cover this as well. They get a transferred basis. So instead of getting the step up in basis at death that you would have if you inherited property, if you're gifted it from somebody during lifetime, the donee takes the donor's basis. And of course, you're going to have a capital gain that goes back to the gain that donor would have had, which could be very significant. So you want to kind of, keep the differential in place there. We encounter this quite a bit in our planning, because oftentimes clients think, well, boy, should I gift some assets to the next generation, or I have a grandchild that's been born, I want to do some things, or maybe move the family cabin. Well, you need to understand you're giving up that step up in basis. You're going to have the transferred basis and the embedded, therefore, capital gain when they dispose of that asset. So from a strategic perspective, it can be the wrong decision to make, even though the heartstrings are telling you, boy, I wish I could move this family home to the next generation while I'm living, what have you. Big issue to bring up, and we didn't want to forget in this program, is for those that are living in community property states, and there are 9 of those community property states in the United States, New Mexico, Nevada, California, Wisconsin, just to name a few. And if you're in one of those states, there's a special rule which allows a full basis adjustment at the first death of a husband and wife. So if you have property in joint tenancy, normally you're just going to get a half a step up in basis. So if the asset has a current fair market value of $100,000, but the basis is $2,000, you only be able to step up halfway at the first death. Okay. And then of course the survivor could get the full step up in basis. But if you want to dispose of that asset during that overlife, you're going to have this significant gain. In the tax code, there's a special provision with respect to community property states. And at the first death, they get 100% in full step up in basis. And so that can be a super powerful thing to remember. And from a strategic standpoint, if you move from a community property state to a non-community property state, say from California to Florida, for example, or North Carolina, Georgia, et cetera, you're going to want to make sure you identify that community property, perhaps put it in a separate trust so that when that property is disposed of, you can still get, that step up in basis after the first death, that full basis adjustment, and you can keep the purity of those assets. So you might sell a house and then acquire a new house, and then make sure that that new house is identified as continuing community property, even though you're no longer living in a community property state. So those are some of the tricks just with respect to, joint tenancy assets, making sure you get an appraisal, the income tax side of things. Some of the real strategy revolves around these IRD assets now. So this gets a little tricky and a little dicey. We're going to take it step by step. I'm going to pass it to you, Dom, introduce the Secure Act, and then some of the strategy if you're actually inheriting an IRA in nature. So go ahead, Dom.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mike. And I want to just emphasize a really practical tip, because you mentioned K1. That's the letter K and the number 1. That's a tax form. This is something, if one takeaway you want to have is when you're in that estate administration stage as a beneficiary, don't rush to file your income tax return until you talk to the trustee or your accountant to see if there is going to be a K1 issued. Because if you do your tax return and that K1 comes and there's income transferring to you from the estate, you have to then amend your income tax return. So remember that. It might save you a step and a little bit of headache and some additional work. So IRD assets, income with respect to decedent type assets, primarily that's going to be an IRA for most of you that are inheriting wealth, but it also applies to any tax advantage retirement account like a 401k or 403b. And there were some changes under the Secure Act, which was passed in 2019 and was finalized then became effective rather in 2020, that really changed the planning paradigm for most everyone. So the key takeaway here is that unless you are what's considered an eligible designated beneficiary, which we'll go through on the next slide, there's going to be a 10-year distribution window in which all of the money has to be withdrawn from these inherited IRA accounts, and you got to pay tax on those withdrawals. Every dollar that comes out of those accounts goes right on your income tax return as taxed as ordinary income in accordance with your marginal income tax bracket. You may remember before the passage of the Secure Act, the stretch IRA concept, which meant that if you inherited an IRA without regard to who you were, you could use your life expectancy generally and defer income tax over your lifetime, which could be a 35, 40-year time period, depending on how old you were when you inherited the account. That's pretty much gone for most individuals. And if you find yourself in this 10-year period, right, step one is understand what type of beneficiary you are, what the distribution period is. You want to do some planning, right? If you inherit the account and you got a 10-year period and you're still working, might make sense to limit distributions to the RMD or required minimum distribution in those working years, and then maybe take larger distributions when you're no longer working, no longer have that income, and are in a lower effective tax rate, if that makes sense. So again, I mentioned the 10-year rule applies to many people, but those that are considered an eligible designated beneficiary, and we have a listing of those types of beneficiaries on the screen, can still use life expectancy. So very important to determine whether you qualify for this additional income tax deferral, which has a lot of benefits. So EDBs, or eligible designated beneficiaries, are surviving spouses of IRA owners, minor children, not necessarily grandchildren, but minor children under the age of 21, according to the latest proposed regulations, disabled individuals, chronically ill individuals, and individuals that are not more than 10 years younger than the IRA owner. So this is typically going to be a sibling is where we see this classification. If you're in one of these categories, you can still use the life expectancy or stretch method. Surviving spouses have very unique abilities. It's good to be a surviving spouse sometimes from an income tax standpoint, because you can actually treat that IRA that you inherit from the decedent spouse as your own, add it to your own IRA as a rollover, put it in your own name, and then you can defer withdrawals until your required minimum distribution age, which is now either between 72 and 75, depending on your birth date. So don't lose sight of that. Really important to determine what your required distribution period is, and then you can discuss the best way to realize that income over that time period to minimize overall taxes. We wanted to include this chart because it lays out a lot of what I just said, but there's 2 points we want to emphasize, and this is something that can catch people off guard. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you see the big red circle with the slash going through it, right? What often catches beneficiaries off guard is when they discover that their parents' estate was named as the beneficiary, which often happens when the IRA owner fails to name a beneficiary. Many times the estate is the designated or default beneficiary. If you find yourself in that situation, it's possible that the IRA account has to be withdrawn over a 5-year period if the original IRA owner died before their required minimum distribution date. If they died after their required minimum distribution date, it might be a ghost life expectancy, which might be shorter than 10 years. So trap for the unwary, if you see that the estate was named as the beneficiary, throw up a red flag and make sure that you're following the rules appropriately to avoid penalties for not distributing enough, which can be pretty harsh. The other point we want to emphasize on this chart is when a trust is named as the beneficiary. Many families see the benefit in creating revocable living trusts during lifetime for probate avoidance purposes and convenience of administration, but that trust can create further sub-trusts that are designed to hold assets and protect money from a beneficiary for a lot of reasons. Estate tax planning being one of them, just making sure monies are properly stewarded for a young beneficiary. But many families are choosing to leave their retirement accounts like IRAs to a trust, so those retirement accounts can also be protected with the rest of the trust estate, because beneficiary designations ordinarily bypass the written estate planning documents. And if you're receiving your IRA and it's held by a trust, really important to understand the terms of that trust, right? Ask the trustee about that. You might also be the trustee, by the way, right? That's very common. But you want to understand the terms of that document, work with your attorney to confirm whether or not that trust qualifies as a designated beneficiary under the tax code to make sure that you can use the 10-year rule. Otherwise, a 5-year rule or more accelerated time period could apply. And then there's some strategy involved around minimizing income tax. Money that is distributed to the beneficiary from a trust generally takes the income and flows it through, so the beneficiary can pay income tax at their ordinary income tax rate. If money is retained by the trust when it's withdrawn from an IRA, the trust generally has a higher income tax rate because the trust tax brackets are much narrower than individual brackets. You get to the top federal income tax bracket in a trust of 37% at $15,000 of income roughly in 2024. So really important to understand those distinctions as well. Mike, when you inherit a substantial amount of money, what should you be thinking about when it comes to your own estate and gift tax planning?
Let's switch gears to estate tax. But before we do, I just want to drive home a couple of points on the planning with respect to the IRA. So if you receive the IRA, you're inheriting it. Yeah, great. Thanks for putting that chart back up. You're kind of locked in. You're going to have to see where you are on this chart. But there's a couple of things to point out is that you're going to then have flexibility with respect to your own planning that you should be reconsidering and thinking about. So you've got your own IRAs, you've got this decedent IRA to be certain that you just inherited, and it's kind of locked in depending on what the parameters were for the person you're inheriting it from. But you might do some different things. For example, with your assets, you might say, gosh, I'm locked into a 10-year distribution period here, but now I've got some additional assets, and there's a niece or a nephew that I have, or a child, that is maybe disabled. Maybe you take a piece of your IRA, maybe not all of it, and you say, I'm going to earmark that for a disabled beneficiary trust, as it shows here, which is all green. And now I'm going to get back out from underneath that Secure Act rock, and I'm going to have a stretch IRA for a disabled beneficiary. It's still going to lock in those assets into that supplemental needs trust or disabled beneficiary trust, but you're going to get that super beneficial deferral of income tax. And again, the fact that you inherited an IRA and you're on this chart gives you the chance and the flexibility to look at your other assets and tweak them and readjust them. So everything is sort of wired together and interrelated. The other one here that I think people often forget about, and I just want to remind the audience, is that most people think IRA directly to spouse, take advantage of the spousal rollover, but you can actually name the IRA to a trust for the benefit of your spouse and still get the single life expectancy table for minimum distributions. So for example, if your spouse is age 72, the minimum distribution period is going to be a divisor of 1 over 17.2, which is about 5%, which means in sort of non-tax or legal jargon, you can drive the IRA into a trust for the benefit of your spouse, make sure that those assets are going to drop down to children. They're not going to become dissipated in a surviving spouse. If there's a remarriage, if there's an asset protection issue, maybe a plaintiff's a tort claim or something like that, a lot of asset protection, controlled with respect to the disposition at the second death, and you're still going to get significant deferral of the income tax. Not quite as good as a full spousal rollover, but significantly stronger and still in that sort of stretch mentality. So again, I just kind of wanted to emphasize a couple of the strategies there. That's again a reason why you want to step back and take a look at this if you're inheriting an IRA, to take a look at it. Let's switch to estate tax, and we've got some things to think about here. So good news again on the tax side is the federal threshold for estate tax liability. The exemption is now super high. Historically, it's at 13.61 million, which is as high as it's been in quite some time. It is scheduled to, so that's the threshold before you would be subject to federal estate tax. The rate is 40%, and that's per person. So a couple would not hit federal estate tax until they got into the 26 million-ish range. And the credit is portable from one spouse to another, which means if one spouse doesn't use the credit, the other spouse can pick up their unused $13 million exemption from federal estate tax. So we're in a pretty good place now. Unfortunately, even though we're in a good place, it's going to get less beneficial, because next year the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions are set to expire at the end of 2025. That will then get cut in half, as will all of the other provisions, the child tax credit provisions, the lower tax income tax brackets, et cetera, unless they get extended. And on the estate tax side, that'll push us down to a 7 million-ish inflation adjusted number. Okay, still pretty high. But there's always, estate taxes are a finicky thing. The American Families Plan just a few years ago and Build Back Better proposed a $3.5 million credit, or maybe a $2 million credit per person. So if you're inheriting property, there's a couple of things to think about. One is that you might think about what's called a qualified disclaimer. So rather than receiving the assets and then finding yourself in a situation where you need to gift, you've got a taxable estate or a potential taxable estate and you want to get out of it, you can, and then you have to work with the gift tax section of the code, you can actually disclaim it and block that inheritance within 9 months of the date of death and let those assets fall to the next generation. So that's a way to keep it outside of your estate. So if you're inheriting and you're within that time period, you might consider this special provision under the tax code to do a qualified disclaimer. Downside is it's irrevocable and you can't have any interest in it, okay? And it has to be done within 9 months, and you can't control where it goes. It's going to end up going to whoever the next beneficiary is, if it's a, for example, an asset like an IRA passing to a named beneficiary, or if it's coming under an estate plan, it's going to go as to whatever the estate plan says. You can't disclaim, block it, and then tell where the asset is to go. But it is something to keep in mind, especially as the credit amount gets cut in half next year. And then again, as the threat always looms, Washington, they tend to be pretty finicky on the estate tax side of things, and their appetite pretty strong on the revenue, needs for revenue and additional spending. So you never quite know what's going to happen. And so a qualified disclaimer might be something to think about. The other strategy here on the estate tax side is, and this doesn't often work well, but before you receive the inheritance, if it's a pending inheritance and you and your spouse or you as a single person are sort of in that place where you're kind of worried about estate tax, or you're worried about just asset protection, If it's not too uncomfortable, you can talk to the person who might be considering you for an inheritance and say, rather than leave that asset to me outright, can you put it in a trust with myself as trustee? And then I can use it if I need it, okay? And it'll stay off of my balance sheet from a future estate tax perspective. And that can easily be embedded. It's not a difficult, complex structure. Again, it's sometimes hard to approach that subject with the more senior generation because they think you're sort of counting on the inheritance or getting involved in their affairs. But it actually can be super beneficial. And when you do that, you can have a trust of which you are the trustee, you're the beneficiary, so you're making distributions to yourself. You can also spray those assets to your children or grandchildren as you decide for weddings or down payments on homes and things like that. So lots of flexibility. You can change the disposition at your death and direct it, unlike the qualified disclaimer. And it's entirely off of your balance sheet from an estate tax perspective and from an asset protection standpoint. It's protected from your creditors. So there's just huge protection there. Hard to do often, but worth noting. And we find that in working with clients, oftentimes when we're working and we understand all of a sudden there's this taxable estate. Hey, can you talk to mom or dad or uncle, aunt, whomever, and sort of set that up. So it's a powerful strategy and one not to forget. Let's just talk about state estate tax briefly. There are states that, and I was scanning when Dom was speaking there a little bit on the Q&A. We'll try to get to all the questions. We got a lot of them coming in. But states do have different thresholds for state estate tax. Okay. There aren't many states left that have a state estate tax, but for example, you can see the chart here. If you're living in one of those states, Illinois, the threshold is 4 million. Massachusetts is 2 million. It's not uncommon for that exemption to be somewhere between $1 and $4 million. That would be the threshold if there's a state estate tax. Some states also have a state inheritance tax. The difference is on the state estate tax, it's based on the total value of the assets. On an inheritance tax, it's based on who receives it. And usually it's less, more of an exemption, less tax if it's a spouse or children, and then you sort of work your way down, and the same dollar amount to a cousin or to a friend is going to have a higher level of tax than it would to a closer family member. And you can see there's Maryland there even has an inheritance tax and a state estate tax as well. So you got to be careful of those states as well. And again, they may not have the portability that the federal government allows on the federal estate tax side of things. So we just want to make sure we covered kind of the beachfront, made sure we talked about estate taxes and some strategies there. I like this next slide we put together, Dom, on the because I think it sort of brings things home. Okay, so now I've inherited the asset and I have this estate plan, and I kind of want to keep it in the family. I want my spouse to be able to use it. But, you never know. There could, one spouse could survive the other by 20, 30 years. And there could be a whole nother, remarriage, another life. And these are sort of family assets. And I kind of want them to stay in the family. I want to protect my spouse and I want them to have use of those assets. But is there, how would I amend my estate plan, or what would I do to accomplish those objectives? So I'll let you take it there and show the solution on this.
Yeah, great lead in, Mike. So like we mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, when you receive a significant inheritance, it's going to change a lot for you. And one of the things that I think is a high priority is just reevaluating the terms of your personal estate plan. And like Mike said, when you inherit wealth from a loved one, whether it be a parent, an aunt, or an uncle, someone who is significant in your life, you might view those monies a little bit differently than you would from money that you acquired with your spouse or on your own accord. And I think one thing to keep in mind in the planning process is that, and this is very prevalent now, unfortunately, but divorce planning is at the top of minds for many people. And if not divorce, just making sure that inherited money and other assets that you've accumulated stay in the bloodline, so to speak. So quick note on inherited property, just to set the stage. Generally speaking, in most states, if you inherit an asset from a loved one, even if you're married, that asset is deemed to be separate property, generally speaking, unless you commingle that asset with marital property. So what does that mean? If it stays separate and you can show that it's inherited, if God forbid there was a divorce, right, that isn't automatically included in the marital estate for dividing assets. So sometimes it's important to keep those monies in a separate trust, like you mentioned earlier, Mike, or account for them a little bit differently. And that's not necessarily, you know, what everybody does, but it's just something to keep in mind if that's something that's important to you, if you have that concern. And then I think it's important then to determine how do you view these assets that you've inherited? Are they meant to supplement your lifestyle now? Are they meant for the next generation? And when you evaluate your trust plan, you think about changing provisions, you might find yourself in a situation where all of these questions are on your mind, right? Which is the importance of reviewing what you have now and re-engaging your attorney. But let's say that you inherit money and now you have some potential future estate tax issues, or you know, you do have concerns, right, that those assets are going to be protected for the spouse, so they're used for that spouse's benefit, and that there's some sort of structure in place at the second death for your children. You could create a revocable living trust plan or a testamentary trust structure in your will that allows a portion of those assets to be sheltered from estate tax using up your exemption, right? 13.61 is the federal number in 2024, lower number starting in 2026. So you could have family or credit shelter trust provisions that take those assets, keep them out of the survivor's estate, and protect them from a remarriage situation, like Mike had said, and then you can ensure that the remaining assets in that trust then descend down to your children to be further protected. Really important to really understand what you're trying to accomplish and make sure that your legal documents have the right structure in place to protect those assets and accomplish other goals that you have. So this next slide just shows that concept, right? You have your trust, you pass away, the trust becomes irrevocable, and that inherited money then is held in a family trust for the spouse's benefit, and it's protected, right? It's not included in their estate for estate tax purposes, it's there for the next generation as you choose. And like Mike said, there's a lot of ways you can design the trust from a flexibility standpoint, but this is just a general a viewpoint. Mike, did you have anything to add to those couple slides?
Yeah, so here, I mean, you can just sort of see pictorially that you have separate trusts. So the idea is, okay, you know, these assets, if you have a joint trust at this point in time, you might consider going to see an attorney, husband and wife, let's do separate trusts, because I don't want to put it in a joint trust and then there's a dissolution of marriage and, you know, something comes up and now all of a sudden those inherited assets are in this single joint trust. You wouldn't want to commingle them otherwise. But what you can do is do this separate trust structure, take the inherited assets, put them in the trust of the inheriting person, and then that trust creates, as this shows, the yellow trust, the credit shelter trust there. That's the trust, and the surviving spouse can be trustee of that trust, so you don't necessarily need to involve a, you know, corporate trustee or anybody else. They're the trustee, they're the beneficiary. Again, similar to what I was discussing before, they have the power to spray it to your children together. Like, it's just, there's no disadvantage really to the spouse, because, you know, they're intimately involved. The trust is for their benefit, and it's locked in that yellow trust there. And then if they don't need those assets and they're not going to decide in their discretion which children and on what basis or how things are to be handled, you know, for the children, then they will stay. You know, they're going to stay in the family like that. So, you know, just another strategy. I think oftentimes people inherit and then they commingle and they buy things, and this is where things get, you know, kind of, you know, crosswise. There's ways to accomplish smart objectives, asset protection planning, and, you know, again, you're not disadvantaging, you know, in any way a surviving spouse. So I think it's a sort of a natural way to design an estate plan, quite frankly. And you might move other assets to the other spouse's trust, like the house, for balancing purposes, or, you know, you've got the IRA maybe that's going to use the spousal rollover through naming the spouse as primary beneficiary. You're going to change the beneficiary, you know, from a family trust to the surviving spouse, so that you get now the longer distribution period with respect to a spousal rollover. So just again, you know, sort of a holistic approach there. But yeah, that's kind of final thoughts on that.
great points. Yeah, I mean, you don't want to create confrontation necessarily, but just keeping these principles in mind, it helps you better design your estate plan, so things work as intended. And then you mentioned this a little bit earlier, Mike, but when you actually receive the IRA, right, from a loved one, you're pretty much locked in to that distribution period. But you have the ability to name beneficiaries on that account, just like you would your own IRA. And the beneficiaries would be the ones that receive the asset at your passing, right? Those beneficiary transfers, again, happen independently of what your estate documents say. So it's good to look at everything comprehensively. And there's a lot of different options, and it's going to be dependent on the size of the IRA account in comparison to the rest of the assets that you have. Your intended beneficiaries, station in life. Are they young? Still learning life lessons? Are they older, maybe more mature, able to handle a large sum of money if it was given outright, for example, and not held in a trust for their benefit? Do they have estate tax problems of their own you're trying to help solve for them in your own estate plan? So, good to have a discussion about the right approach to take when aligning your now beneficiary designations on the inherited assets with your overall estate plan parameters. And we've got a great diagram here that just highlights some of the options. We talked about a little bit of this before in our Secure Act recap. Oftentimes the surviving spouse is named as the primary beneficiary because of the flexibility. But like Mike said, it might make sense if it's important to have some certainty that those assets are protected to name a trust for the spouse's benefit. And you want to make sure that those assets in the trust, or the trust itself rather, is structured properly to allow for that income tax deferral opportunity. A lot of times we're seeing this for estate tax planning too, especially if you live in a state that has a lower than the federal estate tax exemption, like Illinois, where Mike's joining us from, has a $4 million per person estate tax exemption. So sometimes it just makes sense to hold those retirement accounts in a trust for those reasons. Right, you could leave the IRA assets to your children outright. Again, there are concerns about the ability to properly manage the money, right? You might consider holding those assets in a trust for the benefit of a child. Sometimes it's even a little bit more deep thinking, because it's possible that a grandchild could be a potential inheritor of your money. So even if you intend to leave your money in an IRA or under your estate in general to your children outright, because they're able to handle the money, right, and you're comfortable with that, you might have different thoughts when it comes to a young grandchild, right? So you have the option of leaving those retirement accounts and other assets in a trust for a grandchild in the event that the child predeceases. You definitely want to make sure that the design is correct to avoid pitfalls with unintended acceleration of income tax, but just giving you some ideas on the different approaches that are available. Mike, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Yeah, we use this chart quite a bit in our planning because it demonstrates the 5 different options essentially, and then you can see in red some of the pitfalls, in green some of the benefits of it is a balancing test, right? Asset protection versus income tax planning. But one of the things with respect to a strategy around inheriting in an IRA is, if you're not an eligible designated beneficiary and you're fitting into one of those 5 categories, spouse, special needs situation, et cetera, you're going to be struck with that 10-year Secure Act, no longer stretchability principle. And if there is tax that's in there, what you might do, and we've seen this many times, we're working with clients, embedded in their estate plan is a charitable bequest, or 5% to charity or a church, or 10% or something like that, and then the heirs taking the other pieces of the estate. You want to do that in as most efficient manner as possible. Well, if you have an asset like an inherited IRA that's subject to 10 years, at least in the near term, during that time period you're surviving that person who left you, that might be the account that you want to name as a beneficiary, the charity. And so you take that bequest out of the trust, move it to that IRA, use that decedent IRA that you inherited as the tool to fund that bequest, and now all of a sudden that charity is getting that asset income tax free, and whatever the balance is in there during that shortened or compressed time period. So this is where you want to get all of the different cylinders sort of firing together if you really can take a holistic look at things. And even on that, on that IRA, as that chart showed, you could name a donor advised fund, because you could fund that. That can be a beneficiary of an IRA at death. And then when you die, your children could be the successor owners, or designees of that donor advised fund. So now you've got, you're avoiding that income tax. You're using the compressed asset to fund your charitable, not other assets in your estate. So very tax efficient and wise. And then you're getting sort of the ability for them to, to again, have some of that sort of life lessons, like it's important to give back to the community or to the arts or to the church or what have you. And so now you're instilling, even additional value propositions into your estate plan, sort of an ethical will type of structure. So kind of a unique situation there. This slide we put together, it really echoes what we've been talking about, in that when a life event happens, which is what we always say here at Savant, it's a time to get your advisors together, take a look at things, and make sure things are lined up accordingly. Nothing could be even more important when you're inheriting property. Take a look at asset protection goals, tax efficiency, liquidity issues, and stack those beneficiaries, by the way, because you can have on your IRA a primary and a secondary, and you might have some built-in planning options. You can pull one way or push the other way if you have optionality in the planning and do it ahead of time. So I had a lengthy meeting this morning on that regard with respect to IRA, and when we concluded, we had just make some changes and give us some great flexibility there. You'd be amazed at some of the results that you can possibly have. So, and again, you can disclaim on IRAs or beneficiary assets just like you can on the other inherited assets, as long as you're within that, within those parameters, within 9 months. It's a full disclaimer, and then you don't retain any interest or direction downstream. So, okay, so Dom, now we've inherited these assets, and so our philosophy is going to change, right? All of a sudden, I've got additional assets. I was managing my risk and my return. I was heavy into equities, a 70-30 portfolio, but now I've got additional resources. This could change how I look at my asset allocation. And let's just talk about that for a few minutes and some of the important things to think about there.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. And again, this is a big decision point when you reevaluate your overall financial plan, right, in light of receiving these inherited accounts. So just basic terminology, your asset allocation is the mix of different asset classes that are actually invested in marketable securities and other investments. And really what people remember about asset types are stocks and bonds, right? That's a simple way to put it. Those are the different asset classes at a high level. And to Mike's point, right, you might have an allocation that makes sense for you based on the current assets that you own, right? And it's important to revisit your financial plan to make sure that your investments are aligned with what you want to do in the future as far as your spending goals, to maintain your lifestyle, travel. But when you receive this additional inheritance, you might choose to take less risk, for example, right? Because now you have this extra cushion available to help weather the storm, right? If there's more turbulent markets, it can just add a little bit more liquidity to the portfolio. You might take a different approach is one of the takeaways. We have a slide on efficient frontier investing. So it's important when you're designing your investment portfolio to be broadly diversified. Use low cost investments, make sure that you're spreading the risk among as many different asset classes as you can. There's a theory that if you can optimize your risk reward trade-off by strategically weighting those asset classes, you'll be able to minimize the level of volatility or up and down price fluctuations and maximize the amount of potential return based on that risk level. So it's a good illustration of the decisions. The lower the risk portfolio, the lower the expected return. The higher risk portfolio, higher expected return. So back to this, in terms of receiving inheritance, depending on how you view those monies, for example, let's say you want to earmark those funds for future generations, right? You might choose to take more risk with those assets to achieve a higher expected rate of return. So they grow because you're not planning on touching those, but you want a more conservative allocation for the money that you're going to rely on for your own retirement needs. So hopefully those concepts make sense. Again, this isn't necessarily meant to be a presentation on like the perfect investment strategy, but it's going to influence those decisions that you make with what investments you ultimately choose in the portfolio. And then never forget about the different account types that you own. We talked about this a little bit earlier, Mike, on the income tax concepts. There's really 3 tax buckets that we typically see. There's pre-tax accounts like IRAs, 401ks, and 403bs. Those assets grow tax deferred. When monies are withdrawn, you pay ordinary income tax on those withdrawals. You have the middle bucket, the taxable bucket, that are capital gain type assets, right? A trust account, an individual brokerage account. You purchase assets. When they're sold, there's capital gains tax paid on the difference between the purchase price and the sales price. And then there's the Roth bucket. Roths are tax-free accounts. So the Roth account grows tax-free. And then when money is paid from the Roth, it's a tax-free distribution to the account holder. So the idea is when you're designing that allocation, right, in light of this inheritance, you want to make sure that you're minimizing your income tax exposure by strategically locating, it's called asset location, the different investments in the different buckets. For example, if you have a conservative portion of your portfolio in bonds, bonds pay interest, and interest is taxed at ordinary income tax rates. So oftentimes it makes sense to put those bond holdings in your IRA account, because when the interest is paid, there's no tax due, right? Because it's a tax advantage, tax deferred account. And then if you have asset classes that are maybe lower yielding, but have high capital appreciation potential, maybe put those assets in your Roth bucket, so that Roth bucket can grow at a potentially higher, and faster rate, because the investments are more aggressive, and then that tax-free bucket is larger. And then of course the taxable bucket for everything in between. So hopefully that makes sense. It just it warrants another look at your investment strategy. Also your financial plan as well, right? When you inherit money, the obvious result is that you can spend more potentially, right? And retire early. So just good to reevaluate everything. And then Mike, we have about 10 minutes remaining in our presentation, and we want to just touch on some generational planning issues. So go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, and this is, we'll say, we've got lots of great questions, I said, coming in, and we've been trying to answer them along the way to sort of work in some of the answers. Hopefully you're getting some answers, but we're always, available to later on answer questions. So now you've got this inheritance and estate planning. You want to think about, generational planning. So, what does this mean for me going forward again? And the first thing you do is, reorganize your affairs. We're big planning ahead here at Savant and our wealth transfer team. We've got a trust and estate administrators guide that we encourage clients to put together and leave with their estate planning documents, so their family members or their fiduciaries can find it and they know what to do. So if you've inherited, maybe it might be a tangible personal property item. It might be some coin collection. It might be some antiques or some artwork or something like that. Make sure you got it insured, that you have your appraisal, and then it shows up on your trust and estate administrator's guide. Where do you want this asset to go next? And maybe you articulate it with the fact that, hey, this was my uncle's. He got it from my great uncle, and it's an item that came over from family through Europe or something like that, or some family heritage, and has some faith-based value proposition that you want to make sure the next generation learns about, knows about. So identify that. Again, everything in estate planning is planning ahead for that estate. We want to be thinking forward thinking with respect to those assets, and what can we do, on a proactive basis. This brings us to, trustee selection and asset protection for the next generation. So now perhaps is a time to think, gosh, this changes my dynamic and how I'm going to look, towards the next generation. I'm going to take these assets, I'm going to keep them in trust for my children, rather than outright to them, because I want them to descend down. And so all of a sudden, you might be thinking about, maybe a corporate trustee rather than a family member as trustee, downstream for some independence. You maybe now can afford to have a sort of a corporate trustee, or you think through that at death. That can often be a good solution because it keeps the peace in the family. A corporate trustee is independence, it's not emotional, doesn't sort of carry with it the baggage of having family members in charge. So perhaps maybe it's a time to rethink your estate plan. And does an ultimate corporate trustee make sense downstream? You can always layer trustees. You can always name family members and then let them default, again, kind of like a disclaimer, to a corporate trustee. So the theme again is, thinking about your estate plan, taking the opportunity at this life event to do that, and it can impact the decisions you've made previously. Another area where that may occur is if you put together, if something happens to you, trusts for the next generation or for grandchildren, and you were thinking about a certain dollar amount in those trusts, and now all of a sudden the resources have changed. Well, 3% distribution, if it were a unit trust distribution or a more liberal best interest standard, may not make sense. Maybe it should be a HEMS standard, a health, education, maintenance, and support, a tighter distribution standard. And it's always good to be sort of working this through estate planning and needling it and making sure that it's correct and dialed in. And so when you receive this inheritance and it becomes part of your estate and it's going to go downstream, great time to think through who's the trustee? What are my distribution standards? Should I adjust them? Do I have spray powers? The ability to have that generation spray it to even the third generation, or should I pull back on some of that flexibility because of the size of the assets, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the things to think about there.
I know, Mike, you touched on that trustee selection concept a little bit earlier, and also mentioned trust protectors. But was there anything you wanted to add on this last slide here?
No, I think that again, you might add a trust protector for some flexibility, and that would be something that could supplement a corporate trustee, where you might amend the estate plan. Trust protectors can have the ability to change the situs of a trust to a different state, which might be important depending on the income tax side of things, to adjust to changing family circumstances or interpret the document or resolve disputes without having to go to court. So this is a good time to, and again, you've got the resources, it's an inheritance, use it to even better dial in your estate plan, as we said earlier, your beneficiary designations, et cetera, and just sort of, you've got the resources, apply them, use them, and sort of work through that. So
Great.
That's some good questions. Maybe
Wait,
just
before we do
summarize
that, yeah, and this common pitfalls slide we'll cover briefly. Just recaps a lot of the concepts that we had. Really important to understand in that first box, from an IRA standpoint, what your required distributions are to optimize your income tax planning. Avoid commingling inherited assets if that's something that makes sense to you. If you're concerned about potential divorce protection. That step up in basis sometimes gets mixed, right, for capital gains planning purposes. Update your estate plan. We talked about that. And then really just coordinate all your beneficiary designations and take a look at your insurance policies, right? You might need to reevaluate your umbrella coverage, property and casualty to take into consideration your new net worth. So we didn't want to forget to mention that. And then real quick before we take questions, I think Marcy on our marketing team is going to put a link in a chat feature. Now that's not where you ask your questions. We ask you ask your questions in the Q&A feature. But if you've liked these concepts that we've talked about and you want to have a more personalized discussion with a savant financial advisor, we invite you to click the link and schedule a complimentary 15-minute phone call just to see if there'd be a good fit and determine next steps. So wanted to offer that up to everybody. Again, this presentation is recorded and we're going to send out an inheritors checklist with that recording as well. So let's take a couple questions, Mike. Was there one that popped up that you thought was of interest?
Yeah, a couple of good ones. We've covered some of these in some of the simple ones. So an inheritance tax, the state inheritance tax, is based on the person who's receiving it, and an estate tax is based on the total dollar amount in a state. So just sometimes states have thought, look, we're going to tax it based on who's receiving it, and other states say, no, we're going to tax the whole dollar amount. So just two different philosophies that have been out there for a long period of time. Another question: if you if you do receive an inheritance, how should it be titled? I've received it, and how should I title it? Well, this is the earlier example that we gave. If you put it in a joint account and commingle it, it's going to lose its status that it has in almost every, I think, in every state in the United States that I'm familiar with. I'm licensed in Wisconsin and Florida and Illinois, and I'm familiar with a lot of other states. Once you start commingling the assets between a husband and a wife, you lose the separate identity. And if there's a unfortunate dissolution, you're going to lose that protection. The claim is going to be made. So you want it either titled separately, or, as I said earlier, we talked about a separate trust. You would have a separate trust. So if you have a joint trust, you might want to get separate trust and title it in that separate trust. Again, it's not it's mostly about just keeping it in the bloodline. And so it's you can use those devices to protect a surviving spouse, even though it's in a separate trust there. You got a favorite question there, Dom?
Well, I think there's a lot of really good questions, but it seems like the common theme is really surrounding income tax planning. Like we mentioned earlier, generally, at the time you inherit the asset, right? Generally, no income tax is due. But depending on those types of assets, there might be income tax when money is taken out of the account or an asset is sold. So I think that's important. If you have an IRA account, right, you pay income tax when the money comes out of the IRA. You'd look at your tax bracket with your tax advisor to determine what withholding is appropriate. They can give you a sense on that. If it's an after-tax account, like a trust account or brokerage account, when you sell assets, hopefully there was the step-up done that reset the cost basis, but then you pay capital gains tax on the appreciation since the date of death, and then the market value when the asset is sold. Roth accounts, again, the distribution is tax-free for everybody, regardless of who originally owned the account. But again, you've got these different RMD periods that may apply. I think we might have time for one more question, Mike. Go ahead.
All right. I hate leaving questions unanswered. New York doesn't have an inheritance tax. It only has a state estate tax. And if you're a resident of a different state or the District of Columbia, the tax is going to be paid, the estate tax. There wouldn't be an inheritance tax or a state estate tax in a different state. It's the domicile of the decedent. So a question regarding liquidation: you can, post death, if you're working with a trust, you're going to have that capital gain. What strategies? It'd be the same strategies you have for deferring any capital gain. Don't recognize it. Find some, make the distribution in kind to the beneficiary. So if there's been significant appreciation during an administration period, give the beneficiary those assets. If they haven't been liquidated, transfer them in kind. Now the beneficiary is holding those assets with that gain from the date of death, forward, and then they can work with, working themselves out of those gain positions over time. So that would be the strategy there. Most of the time, if you have a corporate trustee, a lot of trustees will liquidate post-death so that you're getting cash and you're not subject to these market fluctuations. That's done because there's a fiduciary liability. You're investing for them, and you don't want to be caught with a significant downturn in the markets, and all of a sudden you as an executor or trustee are have to speak to why didn't I liquidate these assets and hedge against that in that 2 or 3 or 4 month time period for administration. So we are 1:59. It's been great. I'm really happy, Dom, that we did this. We focused on just the inheritance side of things. Again, if you enjoyed it, come back in a couple of months and we'll try to cover a beachfront a little bit more. And again, we have that opportunity. If you want to reach out and get some more individual information, we can do that as well. So
thank you, Mike, again. I think it was a great program, and I know there's questions we couldn't get to. Please reach out, and we'd love to get those questions answered. We also invite you to check out our website at savantwealth.com for more information, where you can also schedule an appointment. So thank you everyone for your time. I'm glad you enjoyed the program.
Thanks.
If you enjoyed this webinar, visit savantwealth.com/guides and download our complimentary guidebooks, checklists, and other useful financial resources.